Hey everybody, Ragnarok here, and I finished my competition in the Philly Open, where I competed in the under 1600 section, and did pretty good. Got 4.5 out of 7, which is great. Final score was, final ranking was 10th, which was disappointing to me. I was hoping to do a little bit better. I played some weird games, I will say. But mostly I think I'm trying to get used to the long time control. For those unaware, in a long tournament like this, we each get 2 hours each side, and then if you get to 40 moves, you get an extra 30 minutes for each side as well. And there's a delay of 10 on that final count there. But this was a little interesting for me because I did the 2-day tournament, and that meant that I had to squeeze 5 games into the first day, which was a little bit... I guess fatiguing is probably the best word. It's a lot to do in one day. I would much rather in the future, when I do the World Open, is going to be to play over 4 or 5 days. That way I get the long time control, and I'm not really playing speed chess, because the 5 games I crammed into one day, 4 of them were 30 minutes with 10-second delay, which is the time that you get added on to the 2 hours later on. But I just squeezed it in. So I had some really weird games, and I wanted to share them with you guys. I had a lot that I had to learn myself, and I want to share kind of what I learned along the way. So this was my first game. It was actually a draw. My opponent was about 1560, and I was playing as black. So e4, e5, the Sicilian opening, knight f3, d6, normal here, and then he played c3. Not quite the Alapin. Alapin would be if he did c3 here first, but I have a different way to react to c3, which I'll talk about in another game in a future video. But with this, I just thought, I guess I would just develop normally, knight f6, kind of put some pressure on this pawn. He plays bishop e2. A little bit of a trick here. I actually can't take this pawn, because if I do, queen goes to a4 check. I have to block the check. Doesn't matter how I block either my knight on c6 or bishop or even queen. Doesn't really matter. Then he just grabs this knight. So I can't take that knight, bishop. So I just develop knight c6 as normal. Everything's going fine here. He has to defend now the d4 pawn, because since I'm blocking the check from the queen, this pawn is now up for grabs. And this delays his d4 move, which I kind of like. So he has to defend this pawn. My queen goes to c7, kind of a weird move. I guess what I was thinking was when he does push d4, I would trade off this pawn and have a nice open file, maybe attacking the bishop. It didn't really work out that way. This was a bit of a mistake on my part. Better probably maybe even just go into the dragon like I normally like to do, because if he just develops, for example, as you've seen in my other videos, bishop on g7 dragon formation is really nice. I do it also in the King's Indian, which is good. Probably would have been a better idea, but I think I was thrown off, 1, with the short time control, and 2, the fact that he played c3 out of order to what I was thinking. So I played queen c7. Bishop to e3 here, just kind of preventing me from pushing this pawn. And here's where I make another mistake. I thought maybe I would get some more space on the queen side here, start pushing some pawns. The problem is my king's still kind of open here. This bishop can't develop, this bishop can't easily develop. I mean, there's no easy spots for it to go to. So I decide, weird move, e6 first, allow me to develop. I think I misplayed, or out of order, the weird move. Here's the weird move. He played knight to b to d2, and then I played b5. The reason this is a weird move is because, I mean, my whole plan really is to start pushing these pawns, maybe push the a5 pawn, but there's a little bit of interrupt here, where he does d4. So he gets his nice ideal pawn structure, attacking all 4 of these squares in the center, which is always nice, but he also opens up his bishop to attack the b5 pawn, which is hanging. This kind of forces me to make a weird decision again. Again, I didn't play this opening well, but this is, how you learn from it. Probably best here is maybe a6, because, if he wants to take here, that's fine. It is double protected by my bishop, this pawn, that is. If he wants to push forward, he'll kind of mess up his central pawn structure. So I think that's kind of okay. This would be an okay game for me. What I do instead is push c4. And I knew as I was doing this, I probably had used maybe 5-10 minutes of my time already, and again, this is a 30-minute game, so not too much time, and we're not even out of the opening yet. But because it was so new to me, I really wasn't sure what to do, so I had to think a little bit extra on it. The reason this is the problem is because I'm overextending my pawns. So this pawn is now, it becomes kind of awkward. If I want to protect, I have to push this pawn, but there's really just not enough time. And again, my bishops are not developed. So this pawn is just kind of up here on the on white side of the board without really an easy way to defend itself. If he can just get rid of this protector, let's just say, well, I'm going to show what he does next. But if imagine this b5 pawn is not here, he'll now have two pieces attacking my overextended c4 pawn. So the way that he gets rid of my b5 pawn is by pushing a4. And that makes sense because now I can't do a6, because if he takes, I take, and because I haven't castled just yet, this rook is now hanging. Even if I had time to get my bishop to b7, that would protect the rook. But just being behind in development, too many pawn moves kind of led to this weird situation. So I can't do a6 now, so instead I do rook to b8, just protecting the pawn. He takes, opening up his rook on the a7 pawn. Double protected, but that's just a constant threat. I can't really move forward with that rook threat there. So I take back with the rook. Here's where he takes back with the knight. He takes the pawn. So I'm down a pawn in this scenario. And the reason the knight is a better move for him to take with is because he's opening up a x-ray or discovery attack on my rook if I leave it there. So I have to move it away. But let's just say I did something, let's say I go bishop to d7. Kind of, you want to think, where's he going to put this piece here? So potentially, I believe best would be, or actually no, even, yeah. So let's say I did this move here. I think the move was, if he goes here, he has an attack on my rook, so if I take here, it's a big trade. So instead, if he goes and takes here, this is now check. So I take back with, let's say, the bishop, well then the rook's hanging. So I think at this point I would be down the exchange. No easy way to compensate. Yeah, I can't take this bishop back, so that would be an issue for me. So I figure easiest is just to avoid all that, take my loss of a pawn, and just go back to b8. Ideally, I've got an idea. I've got an eye on this pawn with this rook here. So once I can get this knight to move, maybe I'll be able to get the pawn back. But he doesn't allow it. He goes rook to, or queen to c2. I push my central pawn. Allowing this bishop to come out eventually is the main idea here, but also just challenging his knight with my pawn, kind of forcing him to break up his knight's center if possible. I take back with knight because if I take with the pawn, I didn't like the fact that my king would be kind of exposed here. Eventually he castles, gets the rook on the same file as my king, and this pawn is now isolated. I didn't really want to have that. Looking at the pawn structure, he's got nice pawns going here with these three right here, and I've just got kind of 3 pawn islands, just kind of looked weird for me. So I wanted to make sure these 4 pawns were still intact, so I took with the knight. And same idea, there's ideas of maybe potentially coming here because the pawn wouldn't take because the queen is unprotected on c2. So he castles, I bring bishop to e7 just to make sure that I can castle now too. Now this is a nice square for him. Because of this strong pawn he has here, he's able to keep a knight, either of his knights here. I do take, but same problem. Now he has this very strong knight, and I've got 2 bishops kind of stuck in the back here. So I just castle, there's nothing I can do about it right now. Rook goes to c1, and now I kick away his knight. Has to go somewhere. Can't really go here. I mean, I guess if it did go here, there's no immediate threat right now, but I think probably I would maybe take the bishop, I don't know. But he goes back to f3 instead. And that kind of allows me to put a little bit of pressure on the queen side, try to get this pawn going, try to prevent him from pushing b4. And then he goes so that he can push this pawn. This bishop would now have a discover attack with 2 pieces attacking the a5 pawn. So I see that coming, but I take a moment to develop my bishop. Now I finally have all my pieces developed. This rook could eventually come to c8 with eyes on the queen as well. He pushes c4, kind of pushes himself. I don't think that's the best move here because now this knight comes in here, opening up the bishop attacking, and this bishop kind of becomes strong as well. He takes it. I don't think this is a good take for him either. I've now got 2 strong bishops, the bishop pair. He can't challenge this bishop easily. This bishop's as good as that knight was earlier here, but as you saw, the pawn was able to push it away. Here, his pawn has already come forward, the c4 pawn. I think it was fine on c3, honestly. Even better, both of these pieces are protecting each other, which is always ideal. He pushes the b3 pawn because he had to... I mean, he didn't really have to protect that pawn. Maybe he was preventing me from going a4 eventually. Let's see, why did he do that? Yeah, no immediate reason that I see. But it allows me to get a little bit of space here and attack on his center pawn. The main threat being if he did anything weird, I would take, and then even up the pawns at least. And then this is a little better for black, I think. So I bring my rook, he has to defend the pawn. And I bring my queen in. Kind of same idea, putting another attacker on this pawn. Of course, I can't take right away with my rook, because then I would lose the exchange. But let's see, I think the main idea here is really just to bring this bishop in here to e4, kind of attacking the queen, just getting a nice, better open position, and eventually shifting my pieces over here to the king side because there's not that many pieces defending the king. So that's why I shift my queen on that side. He wants to do a queen trade. I decided to decline, meanwhile also putting pressure on the e2 bishop. He goes for that queen trade now, and I decide g5, get a little bit more space, progress my pawns a little bit. This is a little bit weak because I do have this rook eventually attacking this pawn. His pawns aren't defending it, so I'm okay with the queen trade. And when he takes, I take back with bishop. And here is the biggest mistake I think he makes, which allows me to come back in the game. I'm able to get a better pawn structure than him and also get my pawns back. So I guess take a second to see what you guys think. There's a couple different ways I think you could go about it, but the answer for me was to take this knight because he has to take back to even material, and now he has the weird pawn structure. I mean, that's really not pretty. This bishop's really much better than this bishop right now, and in addition, I now have a double attack on the rook and the pawn to get this pawn back because this rook is helping support it as well. He goes to b1, and then I take with the rook. I think that's okay, but I think here's where my opponent offered me a draw, and this did end up in a draw. I think I had some better play I could have done. I think holding on to my rooks would have been better. But the problem is, and this is fine, he takes my rook. I think taking with bishop is better right now because these pawns aren't moving forward. This is really nice for me here. If he wants to come here, I think I'm okay here with just kind of pushing a pawn, keeping this nice structure. This rook's not getting by. He also can't come to a1 to try to attack this pawn. There's really nothing he can do to progress on his side. So I think this would have been a better game for me, maybe a win. If this bishop ever moves away, I do have this nice little trick, check, and then winning the rook, which would ultimately win the game because he doesn't have two passed pawns. This is the only pawn that would be able to progress. And my king would probably be able to get over there just fine. I might even take this pawn first, and maybe even sack the rook if needed, but probably not. So yeah, I think that would have been a little better for me. I decided to take back with rook, and then he offers, I think he offered to draw a couple times in these next few moves, and rightfully so. I mean, we've got two opposite colored bishops. The pawn structure is not really going anywhere. My only real advantage is to try to take advantage of the doubled up pawns here, which I don't do, of course, because I think I had only maybe like 4 or 5 minutes left at this point. So I push this pawn, and again, I don't need to do that. The problem is if I move it, which I was thinking of maybe going bishop to e5, attacking this pawn, it's kind of tough for him to defend. He's got some nice ideas coming here. My king's now really out of the game. Eventually, he's going to get the a5 pawn. This is just bad for me, I think. So I didn't really want to allow that. So the reason I did e5 probably was just because after he exchanges, I wanted to have a nice pass pawn, which I didn't have before. But that's really as far as I thought about it. We start progressing. The reason I moved this pawn is because I want to be able to move my king. And also, after this, he's got a light squared bishop. Always remember you want to have your pawns on opposite colors so that you can not be under attack by his bishop. So I just get my king in the center, and I allow him, unfortunately, to undouble his pawns. We just trade. Whoa, I just skipped way too far ahead. Sorry. Let's go back here. I allow him to undouble his pawns, and then I try to give myself a little bit of an advantage. At least my king's closer. I'm trying to really just navigate around here to get behind the bishop. That's the main path of my my king here. Meanwhile, he can't really do anything because all my pawns are defended by my bishop. Even this one is defended because once he comes over here, as I start making my trek over, let's just say he went here and I came in, he actually can't take this pawn because I would push check on the king, also winning the bishop and thus the game. So he can't do that, so he just backs up, which makes sense. I continue my journey in. Now, he could have made a different path here also to get a draw, because he's kind of fighting for a draw. I think I've got a nice advantage, but it's not enough really to win, I don't think. I think if he comes here, which he didn't do in the game, did he? No, he did go there, which forces me to push the pawn. I think he should have come here in the game, because that kind of blocks my king from coming around, because you know he can always defend his bishop, and then there's really no progress either side can make. I can push this pawn maybe, but I'm not going to win both of these. So that probably would have been better for him, but instead he comes into to d5. I bring my bishop back to try to prevent his pawn from progressing. He pushes it anyway. This allows me, instead of going the long way, I can go the short way into attack. I still want to attack that bishop, which would ultimately trade both the bishop and the pawn, leaving me a bishop ahead, which is what happens. He's going towards this pawn over here on a5. I continue, go around. He moves the bishop. And then I go to c2. And the reason for that is if I push right now, yes, I'm up a bishop, but he now has two monster pass pawns, and I can only really trade one of my bishop for one of them. And at the same time, I don't think I have enough time to take this pawn, move out of the way, and move up 5 tempo for the pawn. I believe if you want to play this out on the board, I think white wins in this scenario. It's just not enough time. He queens first. So instead, I go to c2, which I think is the right move, because you know he can't go here to defend the pawn, because then I queen. So instead, he just takes the pawn, which makes sense. And then I take the pawn also. I think at this point I actually lost the notation because I think I had like a minute left or so. So I don't have the full notation, but I'll try to play it out from what I remember. He goes up to d1 again, kind of delaying my my way to go there. I move to b2. King comes back, trying to progress this pawn's movement forward. King goes to c1. Bishop moves out, and now I queen, forcing him to take, and then I take back. And I think he made a mistake here. If I remember right, he moved king to b6. And I can't say I remember why, because the move that makes sense to me is just to go to here. But maybe it's just a loss anyway. Let's just play it out real quick. I would take the pawn, king takes, I take here. This might even be a draw. Yeah, this is a draw. So that would have been a draw as well. When there's two kings, of course, you can't progress at all. But instead, he goes in front. Yeah, again, not really sure. I go here. I think I missed a really good move here, too. This is almost a win. I think he pushes c6. And then I went here. And this is where a touch move comes into play. So in a tournament, when you touch a piece, you have to move that piece. It doesn't matter if I went like this, and I moved it back, and I was still thinking. It doesn't mean I have to move here. It just means I have to move the king. I ended up going this way. Kind of either way, I want to get out of the way to push this pawn forward. But then he makes a mistake, and I didn't think he would make this mistake. I think he had 2 minutes left. I had 30 seconds. He goes, where does he go? He goes here. This was a mistake. I quickly grabbed my bishop. Couldn't tell you why. Because the correct move is to go right here. King to g4. I would have won the game in this point, because if he pushes, I now just take. And now this is just a win. A pawn against a king in this situation would be a draw. But because I have the bishop, that gives me an extra tempo. I'll just play out some of the moves here. There's really nothing he can do at this point. He has to move out. I probably did that a little fast. I'll do some tutorials in the future on pawn endgames, but that would have been a win at that point. But instead, if we go back to the game, I grabbed my bishop, so I had to move it. So I moved it here. So he goes here, and this is just a draw. It doesn't matter what I do. I think I just move here or something. Oh no, I think I I think I moved here. I have to take the pawn, otherwise he's going to queen. So I take, he takes, and you can't mate with just a bishop, so this was a draw. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this game and learned some stuff. I know I definitely did. I think the biggest takeaway from anything in these tournaments is to make sure that you have a basic repertoire of some openings, and that's why I'm going to be starting I don't know, a series on my website ragchess.com where it's main ideas of openings, so you can understand what you really want to do and what you want to accomplish, whether you're black or whether you're white. So that's the thing I'm working on right now. Of course, I'm starting with the dragon since I've done some tutorials there. I've got some articles about Evan's Gambit over there, a really long, in-depth one. It covers as many variations as I could think of. So definitely check those out. But I'm going to go through my next couple games. I think I'm going to do 6 games out of 7. I actually lost the notation for one of them, but it was so similar to my 6th game that I think it's okay. I couldn't actually find the guy to... I think he didn't come back to the tournament, but I couldn't find him to find the notation. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Make sure to subscribe down there. I think you can just click to subscribe. And I'm going to continue uploading videos. Every Monday is what my schedule is right now, but I'm continuing to write on my website. So definitely check out both of those avenues, and I'll see you next week.